In my last video, I challenged myself to see how many garments I could make out of 2 bed sheets. And this one was my favorite. And now I'm going to show you everything that you need to know to make the exact same dress. So go ahead and grab yourself a tea or a coffee and let's get started. Okay, so we're starting off with a beautiful bed sheet, and this bed sheet has a nice trim around the edge with another color, and I want to take advantage of that other color and make a beautiful design on the dress. So I'm trying out how it looks if the trim is at the bottom of the skirt and etc. So I figured I wanted to have the blue part at the top, so I'm folding my daughter's sweater in half, and this is the back part of the sweater, so I'm adding some extra seam allowance for a zipper, and then I'm cutting along the neckline and the shoulder just as the sweater is. Then I'm taking the front part of her sweater and I'm cutting it out on a folded fabric so that the front is in one piece. Then for the sleeves, I'm folding a fabric again in half, and then I'm taking her sleeve and I'm placing it along that folded edge. And I'm cutting out with some extra fabric because I want to have a puffed sleeve, so you need to add some extra fabric around the sleeves. And then I'm also adding a little bit of length. Next, I place the pieces together just to see how it all looks together. And then I'm seeing if it is nice to have the blue part at the top of the skirt or if I should change it and have it at the bottom of the skirt instead. And this is what is so fun when you're using secondhand materials, is that you get so much creative ideas by just taking advantage of the fabric. So this skirt is made out of 2 rectangles. The total length of these 2 pieces will be the full length of the skirt. For the top tier, I cut a rectangle that's about twice the waist measurement. For the second tier, I take the length of the first rectangle and multiply it by 2. So each tier is going to be the double length than the previous tier. And you can add as many tiers as you want, and you can add them wherever you want. And this is how my design ended up looking. Next, we're taking the sleeves and we're going to cut them about 2/4 down at the sleeves, and we're cutting them apart. And then we're folding it open, and I'm taking a nice lace trim and I'm cutting it in the length of the sleeves. And then I'm serging the edge of the raw edge, and then I'm sewing the lace together at the sleeve, and then I'm sewing a nice stitch along that previous stitch to keep the lace in place. Then I'm going to sew the bottom of the sleeve together with the lace, just as we did previous, and then I'm going to do a top stitch here as well. Then I decided to add another layer of lace trim, and I sewed that onto the sleeve as well. Next, I also cut out a lining for the dress, and I sewed the lining together at the shoulder seam and also the front part of the dress at the shoulder. Then I pressed that seam open and on the lining and on the outer fabric. Next, we're going to add some lace ruffle around the neckline. So take a lace trim and start sewing it on the sewing machine with a loose stitch and gather the lace trim. On this machine, my machine just gathered the lace trim as I sewed, but on some machines you have to pull the thread afterwards. After the lace trim is ruffled, you can go ahead and place it along the neckline and make sure that the lace trim fits around the whole neckline, and make sure that the lace ruffles are evenly spread out as you go. Once the ruffle trim was sewed together, I took the lining over the bodice part, right side facing each other, and I sewed a stitch along the neckline to keep everything in place. Then I used my scissor to make small slits around that neckline so that it folds around nicely. And before I fold it all the way out, I'm going to do a support stitch along the lining.
Music licensing reimagined.
Next, go ahead and fold everything out and we can continue on the sleeves. Go ahead and take the sleeves and do 2 rows of stitches with loose settings, just as we did with the lace trim, and take the 2 top threads or the bottom threads and pull them gently so that the fabric gathers. Then you can go ahead and line it on top of the bodice part and place the ruffles at the shoulder seam and sew it together with the opening of the arm. After you have sewed the sleeves together, you can go ahead and use your serger and serge all the raw edges along the armholes and the arms on the sleeve. Then fold the bodice part right side facing each other and sew up the sleeves and the side seams. Next, you can go ahead and fold the sleeves edge 2 times with about 1 to 1.5 centimeters stitch, and then you can take an elastic and feed it through an opening of that hem and make sure that the elastic is not too tight around the wrist of the person you're sewing for. Then you just tie a knot and sew the opening together. Next, I had to trim a bit of the bodice part because I didn't like when it was showing too much of that white part, since I'm going to connect it with a blue skirt. So for the skirt, we're going to start by sewing a rolled hem at the top of the skirt, and then we're sewing 2 parallel stitches along that top part, and we're pulling the thread again, just as we did with the other gatherings. In between those 2 stitch rows, we're going to sew we're going to sew in the middle of these 2 stitch rows here when we're sewing it onto the bodice. So here I'm not going to attach the skirt right side facing the bodice, but I'm going to sew it on top of the bodice. So we're placing it on top, and then we're sewing a stitch in the middle of these 2 stitch rows. Once the skirt is connected, I wanted to add another lace trim at the bottom, or not at the bottom, but before I add the last tier. Once I've sewed the lace trim, I went ahead and I found that other tier and I did the exact same thing. I sewed a rolled hem and then 2 parallel stitches, and I pulled the thread and gathered the fabric to match that previous rectangle. Then I placed the ruffle at the bottom of the skirt and sewed it together. Before I close up the back of the dress, I used my serger and I serged up the raw edges on the back, and then I lined up the back seam and I sewed it together a few inches down from where the zipper is going to start. For the hem, I unfortunately lost some footage, but what I did was that I placed some lace trim and some bias binding on top of each other, and I sewed them together so that I had a nice trim peeking out of the hem. Then lastly, I just installed an invisible zipper at the back of the dress, and I made sure that everything matched up when I sewed it, and the dress is done.